Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about, it's going to be a little off topic from what we talked about this week, where we talked about war and civil war. We're going to talk about international economics one more time. This actually, in a normal semester, I would have done this before our exam. But because of how the exam played out, we're going to do it now. We're just going to talk about, so remember we talked about free trade. And I just want to talk about the other side of free trade and why there's collective action problems in that as well. So let's get after it. I'm going to do a quick recap so you have to go back to your notes necessarily, but if you don't remember anything, go back and look it up. But I know you just studied for the exam, so you probably have some of this. So let's talk about this. Here's my quick recap. Free trade makes everybody better off economically in the long term. This is the key element right there, economically. If all you care about is amount of money and you add up everybody, there's going to be everybody as a whole, not individually, but as a whole, will be better off economically in the long term. So it may take a while, but that's going to be the case. That's great. There are obviously three problems with this. Everyone does not mean me. It means everyone taken as a whole, but not necessarily each individual. So maybe some people get really better off and other people don't get better off at all, and the average becomes better off. Economically, maybe there's other things we value besides just money, and then long term, in the short term, it's going to be very painful. In the short term, we also know that potential losers from free trade are going to have an incentive to stop it. If I stand to lose, let's go economically for just a second. If I stand to lose $1,000, I might be willing to invest, $800 just to make this thing stop. But now if we're talking about larger scale industries, we're talking about a lot more than $1,000. That means I might invest my time, I may invest my money, effort, whatever those sorts of things are. So they'll invest this political power. They'll turn this economic power into political power that they'll use to protect their livelihoods and identities through protectionism. In other words, they'll try and get the state to pass tariffs or subsidies or do something else to protect their particular industry from potentially losing out when free trade happens. Okay, great. We're all back on board. Now here's the question I want to ask. That makes sense when we're talking, remember we talked about sugar producers the other day? And when sugar producers, there's about 4 or 5 of these companies, and they're making tons of money. And they're able to connect with each other, they're able to work together, and they're able to really get the government to say, yeah, we're going to put tariffs on sugar. What happens when the potential losers do not have the political power to protect their livelihoods and identities? This is a broader question, and this is not just a U.S. thing. This is across the board. Like, what happens when I try to convert my potential losses into political power, but I don't have the ability to do that? Either there's not enough, I'm a minority voice, or the system is not reacting to me in some way, whether because the institutions aren't sort of receptive to the voice of the people, like it's not a democracy or something like that, or there's corruption, or there's some other things going on there, or I just am sort of out-competed by corporations that have a lot more money. What happens when this is the case? Well, there's a bunch of things that can happen. Number one, you can just sort of do nothing and grudgingly accept your changing conditions, which is often the case for people. This is probably actually the one that ends up being more often than not, is that essentially if me being a farmer is no longer productive, I might fight it a little bit, but for the most part, in many places, I just kind of have to move on because I'll never have the political power to fight back. They can also passively resist. And when we say passively resist, what we mean is not taking to the streets and marching or anything like that. It just means doing things that essentially you're resisting the system, but you're not doing it in a way that's sort of like an active, like, do this, do this. And often this takes the form of withdrawing from larger society, which we often call crime. If these are going to be the rules of society, and I can't benefit following the rules of society, then maybe the best thing I can do is benefit by breaking the rules of society. And so crime becomes an element of this. In other words, a lot of criminals, I don't know that I want to make this blanket statement, but some criminals are not criminals because they want to be criminals. They're not just sort of jerks. Many criminals, that's fine to say that, many criminals would prefer to make their money in a different way. Let me give you an example from this. So in Somalia had a large fishing industry, and so people Somalians would go out and fish out in the ocean. Well, then it turns out that a bunch of other states came in, like China came in and Europe came in, and they started fishing in the waters off Somalia. And the Somali fishermen said to their state, make them stop. But there wasn't really a Somali state there anymore. It kind of collapsed a little bit. And so when they asked China and they asked Europe to do something about this, China and Europe didn't do something about this. And so as a Somali fisherman, I can't compete. I can't. They have bigger boats. They have better things. I just can't get the fish that I need to get. So what ended up happening was a lot of these Somali fishermen then turned to piracy. And they essentially grabbed those boats. So they grabbed other boats coming through there. And it's not that they wanted to be pirates. They wanted to be fishermen, but they couldn't be fishermen. And there wasn't really a way to use their political power because they didn't really have any political power, so they turned to crime. So that's another possibility of the whole thing. They can actively resist, and this is more of the thing that we see people out in the streets marching or forming social movements or something to that effect. They can also, again, do the boomerang effect. And remember that. One of the problems here is that essentially it's really hard to use the boomerang effect because usually the people that are profiting from this free trade are going to be in those countries where you're appealing to it. And so essentially, how am I going to get others to care about my position when they're getting rich off it? So the boomerang effect does not work as well in these particular cases, but sometimes it does. Another thing I can do is violently resist. In other words, if this isn't working, nobody's listening to me, I can't get my voice heard, I may feel like my only other option is, if you're not hearing my voice, then maybe you'll hear my voice if I yell at you. And yelling essentially means violence. So we look at things like rebellion or terrorism can sort of take that on. We can also add crime on here when crime becomes violent. And the response then, so once, I'm trying my best to get my voice out there, it's not being heard, and maybe at the end of this whole thing it turns into violence. And then what happens, the response is this: the opposition to globalization then gets labeled as backward, unpatriotic, treasonous, evil. Essentially, I'm not unpatriotic, I want to protect my livelihood, and since I can't do that, I have to violently resist, and if I violently resist, then the state starts to say, oh, look at those backward people, they're not into progress, they're not into making the state better, because the state's going to be better with free trade. So clearly, if they are opposing free trade, they not only, they hate the state, and so they're not just criminals, they're treasonous. Then maybe they're even evil. Globalization processes thereby are presented as antithesis of this. So essentially, if they're the violent ones and being evil, then we, the free traders, must be inherently good. It's progressive. It's good for society. The state sort of is able to say, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and that sort of thing. So it becomes even sort of more problematic. That if I was voiceless before, this process here makes me even, can you say even more voiceless? So can voiceless losers, this really sounds like a bad thing, but anyways, can voiceless losers, you know what I mean, organize internationally? The answer is sure they can. International social movements, we see these a lot. The Anti Globalization movement is an example of this. If you need to know what a social movement is, go look that up. But it is essentially groups of people moving together, I guess you could say. Moving is not the right word. Protesting together across large areas and over multiple issues. That's a social movement. Now, here's the issue that I really want to bring up here. If we're going to create a social movement, this is a collective action problem. Now, I want you to think about why it's a collective action problem. In this case, let's say that we have a bunch of people, okay? We're going to have people all over the world who have different reasons but are all mutually opposed to anti-globalization. Now here's the deal. This works if these guys, just like a union, can get together and put pressure on political powers out there, so through movements like this. Not just having a random protest over here and a random protest over here, but essentially coming together and doing a more coordinated effort against this particular thing. So that works if they can form a collective. Now, we know the problems with this, for example. So in this case, my public good might be the social movement. We know that social movement is going to be underprovided because public goods are underprovided. And why is it underprovided? Because of the free rider problem, that essentially they all have an interest in getting together and opposing or forming the social movement that will oppose, say, free trade. The problem is that this one here also has an incentive for all of you guys to do it, and then I'll sit back and watch you guys do it. And what ends up happening is it's really hard to keep social movements going for an extended period of time because of the collective action problem. So you have to solve this collective action problem. What I'm trying to point out here is there's collective action problems all throughout this whole thing, no matter which direction we sort of come at it. And in fact, it's sort of layered collective action problems. It's very complex in that sense, but once you get the basic idea of what a collective action problem is, you can understand it and figure out better how to move things around. We can also ask the question of how will a social movement actually have an impact? Let's say I successfully form a social movement. What then does it do? And we talked about that a little bit when we talked about non-governmental organizations. We talked about non-state actors and how they impact states. All right, you're going to watch a couple videos here just to sort of see the anti-globalization movement that started sort of back in 1999. You're also going to see another sort of one from France, and then we'll come back. It'll be quick videos, and we'll come back, and we'll have a quick little bit after that.